In 2017, Samsung purchased Harman International for $8 billion. With that single corporate signature, an era ended. Across Southern California, the independent car audio installation shops, the garages that once drove an entire aftermarket industry, were already going quiet, their display boards stripped and their installation bays empty. For a generation of American drivers, the name Infinity had meant something physical. It meant pulling into a local stereo shop. It meant tearing the factory door panels off a Jeep Grand Cherokee to install emerald green polypropylene woofers and emit ribbon tweeters. It meant spending a week's wages to make a car cabin sound like a high-end listening room. A decade later, that same name meant precisely the opposite. The famous Infinity badge was now just a licensed logo, glued onto mass-produced plastic speakers, pre-installed on Detroit assembly lines. But the real story of Infinity Car Audio is not just an $8 billion acquisition. It is the story of how a stubborn group of California engineers built a high-fidelity empire, and how the massive scale of their own success quietly engineered the destruction of the American aftermarket listening room. Every week, we tell the stories of American speakers, audio brands, stereo stores, and listening rooms that once shaped how people heard music, movies, and memory. And what happened when the market moved on? Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in Chatsworth, California, in 1968. In 1968, inside a small garage in Chatsworth, California, a physicist named Arnie Nudell and two aerospace engineers, Carrie Christie and John Ulrich, decided that the American listening room required a better transducer. They were not conventional businessmen. They were scientists who spent their days working on laser targeting systems and aerospace electronics, and their nights obsessing over high-fidelity audio reproduction. The result of their obsession was the Servostatic 1. It was not a traditional wooden cabinet. It was a massive, complex electrostatic speaker system that required multiple external amplifiers and cost roughly $2,000. A price that rivaled the cost of a new Chevrolet sedan. Yet, audiophile magazines and high-end stereo dealers immediately recognized it as a breakthrough. Infinity Systems was born. The brand's reputation in the American hi-fi market was cemented as a company that refused to compromise on clarity, depth, or engineering precision. But outside those pristine listening rooms, a much larger, much louder acoustic crisis was being ignored. By the 1970s, the American interstate highway system was a defining piece of the national culture. Millions of Americans spent hours every week enclosed inside Ford Mustangs, Chevrolet Caprices, and Jeep Wagoneers. Yet the sound inside those cabins was objectively terrible. The standard American car audio system consisted of a single AM radio wired to a cheap, paper cone speaker mounted directly in the center of the dashboard. Even if a driver paid the dealership for an upgraded stereo, they received flimsy 6.9-inch paper drivers mounted in the rear deck. These paper cones absorbed moisture, warped in the summer heat, and distorted wildly if the volume knob was pushed past halfway. The American driver had freedom, horsepower, and open roads. They did not have bass, stereo imaging, or high fidelity. For traditional speaker engineers, the automobile was an acoustic nightmare. A living room was a predictable environment where a listener sat quietly between two cabinets. A car cabin was a hostile metal box filled with glass, vibrating metal, and constant engine noise. Temperatures inside a parked car in the American Southwest could exceed 140 degrees in the summer and drop well below freezing in the winter. A standard paper cone woofer, a large driver designed to reproduce low frequencies such as bass and drums, would literally rot, tear, or warp under those conditions. Bringing true audiophile sound into a car seemed mechanically impossible. But Nudell and his team realized that if they could solve the automotive acoustic problem, they would unlock a market vastly larger than the niche world of high-end stereo showrooms. They could own the American road. The solution required abandoning traditional materials entirely. In the late 1970s, Infinity engineers began experimenting with a new substance, polypropylene. Unlike paper, this synthetic polymer was completely impervious to water, immune to extreme heat, and structurally rigid enough to deliver tight, accurate bass without flexing under pressure. Infinity pioneered the injection-molded polypropylene woofer cone. It was a radical shift in American speaker manufacturing. They paired this indestructible woofer with another innovation, the EMIT, or electromagnetic induction tweeter. Instead of a traditional dome pushing air, the EMIT used a flat, ultra-thin plastic membrane suspended in a powerful magnetic field. The tweeter, a small driver designed to reproduce high frequencies, such as cymbals, strings, and vocal detail, could suddenly deliver a level of crystalline sharpness that no conventional car speaker had ever achieved. Infinity did not aim for the mass-market commuter. They aimed for the obsessive listener. When they began introducing these technologies into their automotive speaker lines, the American car audio aftermarket was just beginning to take shape. Independent stereo shops in Southern California and soon across the country realized that an Infinity car speaker was not just a replacement part. It was a physical upgrade that fundamentally changed the geometry of the cabin. A driver could replace a factory paper cone with an Infinity polypropylene woofer and suddenly feel the kick drum vibrating against their leg. They could mount an eMIDI tweeter on the dashboard and experience the illusion of a stereo image, the perception that the singer was performing directly in front of the windshield rather than shouting from the doors. The American Hi-Fi dealer network played a crucial role in this transition. Stereo stores that sold Infinity home speakers began setting up automotive listening rooms. A customer could walk into a high-end audio retailer, listen to a pair of Infinity towers in a carpeted showroom, and then purchase a set of Infinity door speakers to replicate that exact sound on their commute home. This bridge between the living room and the driveway gave Infinity a level of acoustic credibility that brands solely dedicated to car audio could not match. The badge on the speaker grille carried the weight of audiophile trust. By the early 1980s, the name Infinity meant something specific in the American aftermarket. It was a premium commitment. A pair of Infinity car speakers often cost several times the price of a standard replacement set. It required professional installation at a local 12-volt audio shop. It required custom wiring, heavy-duty amplifiers, and door panel modifications. Records suggest that as the decade progressed, Infinity's footprint expanded from specialized California garages to national mail-order catalogs like Crutchfield. A teenager flipping through those catalog pages saw the technical diagrams of the EMIT tweeter and understood that this was not a generic automotive accessory. It was aerospace engineering applied to rock and roll. The factory in California was scaling up. The brand had successfully translated the unforgiving standards of a $2,000 living room system into a product that could survive a pothole at 70 miles per hour. The California engineers had proven that high fidelity could survive the hostile environment of a car cabin. But to truly dominate the American road, they needed a product line that would turn the local car audio shop into a cultural institution and a corporate partnership that would change Detroit forever. In the mid-1980s, Infinity released the product that would define its automotive legacy and change the American aftermarket entirely, the Kappa Automotive Series. It did not look like a traditional car speaker, and it did not sound like one. The primary woofer was an injection-molded polypropylene cone tinted a distinct, vivid emerald green. It was a visual signature, a bold aesthetic choice that told anyone looking into a parked vehicle that the owner had spent serious money to transform their dashboard. But the visual appeal was entirely secondary to the mechanical architecture. Infinity did not sell the Kappa line as a simple replacement part. They sold it as a true hi-fi component system. In a standard factory setup, the high, middle, and low frequencies were all pushed through a single, cheap paper cone. resulting in a muddy, distorted output that fought against the ambient noise of the highway. Infinity physically separated the frequencies. They provided a heavy green woofer for the door panel, a separate emit ribbon tweeter to be mounted on the dashboard or window pillar, and a heavy external crossover box to manage the electrical traffic between them. Crossover, an electrical network inside a speaker that sends bass, mid-range, and treble to the drivers designed to handle them, meant that the amplifier's power was utilized perfectly. The woofer only played the bass and lower mid-range. The tweeter only played the highest, fastest details. The crossover ensured they never fought for the same electrical current. For the listener sitting in the driver's seat, this created a profound psychoacoustic effect. The music no longer sounded as though it was firing at their ankles from the bottom of the doors. It sounded as if the band was performing live, spread evenly across the hood of the car. Inside the cabin, the difference was immediate and shocking. A cassette tape of a live rock concert no longer sounded muffled by wind and engine vibration. The snare drum snapped with absolute authority. The acoustic guitar strings shimmered in the air. The bass guitar possessed a physical, moving weight that vibrated through the driver's seat. Infinity had effectively transformed the daily American commute from a tedious chore into a private, high-fidelity sanctuary. This acoustic precision created a massive new microeconomy because a component speaker system was a complex mechanical commitment. To install an Infinity Kappa system, an American driver could not simply unscrew the factory speaker and plug in the new one. They had to run thick, braided copper wire beneath the carpets. They had to mount the crossover boxes securely under the seats or behind the glove box. They had to cut custom holes in their interior plastic trim to angle the tweeters directly at their ears. This complexity required specialized labor, and that labor fueled the golden age of the independent 12-volt audio shop. A customer did not just buy a speaker, they bought an entire installation ecosystem. In 1987, a premium Infinity Kappa component system could cost over $350 at retail. In the American economy of the late 1980s, that price represented more than a full week's wages for a middle-class worker. And it did not include the cost of the required aftermarket amplifier, the upgraded stereo receiver, or the hours of professional shop labor. A complete, properly tuned installation could easily exceed $1,000. Yet the American market happily paid the price. The endorsement for the California brand was absolute. Car, Audio, and Electronics magazine published glowing reviews of the EMIT tweeter's remarkably flat frequency response. The Crutchfield mail-order catalog, which shipped directly to millions of homes, devoted full-color pages to detailing Infinity's aerospace materials. High-end stereo stores across Southern California used the green Kappa woofers as the centerpiece of their flagship display board demonstrations. Custom installation bays in Texas and Florida began fabricating specialized fiberglass kick panels just to house Infinity components perfectly. Teenage drivers, college students, and wealthy audiophile commuters alike viewed the green cone as the ultimate status symbol of the American road. Infinity had built an impenetrable acoustic moat. Competitors could manufacture cheaper replacement speakers, but they could not easily replicate the crystalline high frequencies of the ribbon tweeter. Nor could the Kaidi. They instantly buy the audiophile credibility that the Infinity badge commanded. However, the aftermarket, no matter how passionate, was mathematically limited. It was capped by the sheer number of people willing to tear apart their own vehicles. If Infinity wanted to reach tens of millions of listeners instead of hundreds of thousands, they could not wait for the customer to drive into a stereo shop. They had to intercept the customer at the dealership. In the late 1980s, the American automotive industry was fighting a fierce battle against a rising tide of imported luxury cars. Detroit needed a way to make their domestic sedans and minivans feel more sophisticated, and executives realized that premium sound was a powerful psychological trigger. In 1988, Chrysler Corporation made a historic announcement. They bypassed the traditional, anonymous factory radio suppliers and partnered directly with the California hi-fi engineers to create the Chrysler Infinity sound system. This was a structural earthquake in the American audio market. It was one of the first times a major domestic automaker explicitly co-branded a vehicle's interior with a respected audiophile company. When a family purchased a new Dodge Caravan, a Chrysler New Yorker, or a Jeep Grand Cherokee, they did not just get a radio. They received an actively equalized acoustic space. The early Chrysler Infinity systems were genuinely ambitious. Instead of relying on a single, weak amplifier hidden in the dashboard, the engineers mounted individual specialized amplifiers directly onto the speaker baskets inside the doors. The factory had essentially pre-installed a custom aftermarket system. The buyer did not have to cut wires, remove door panels, or visit a stereo store. They simply checked an option box on the dealer invoice, rolled the windows up, and drove off the lot, surrounded by high fidelity. For the first time, an American driver could turn a volume knob and feel the singer sitting directly on the dashboard without ever picking up a tool. The badge on the grille was not decoration, it was a promise about sound. But that massive success introduced a dangerous new logic to the market, and the very system that made Infinity an automotive empire was quietly preparing to dismantle the culture that had built it. By the early 1990s, the American car audio aftermarket had exploded into a multi-billion-dollar industry, and Infinity Systems was positioned at the absolute center of the culture. The original Chatsworth engineering philosophy had successfully scaled across the continent, moving from niche audiophile circles into mainstream American youth and commuter culture. The physical reach of the brand was staggering. A teenager in a Midwest suburb did not need to visit a high-end California audio salon to understand the appeal of a ribbon tweeter. They simply opened the latest Crutchfield catalog, mailed out by the millions from Charlottesville, Virginia, and studied the technical breakdowns of the signature green woofers. They walked into a Magnolia hi-fi demonstration room in Seattle to hear the clarity for themselves. They visited regional electronics chains in Texas, independent 12-volt installation bays in Florida, and premium stereo showrooms in Chicago. The massive network of American audio distribution had fully embraced the Kappa and Reference series lines. The trust in the car audio division was directly funded by the company's towering reputation in the living room. While younger drivers lusted after the Kappa car speakers, their parents were buying Infinity SM series and Reference standard towers for their home theaters. The badge carried an aura of uncompromising acoustic science. If a brand could build the legendary Infinity IRS, a $70,000, 7-foot-tall home loudspeaker system that required a dedicated room, then the American consumer naturally trusted their engineering inside a car door. This dual dominance, owning both the quiet living room and the loud highway, gave the company a halo effect that traditional 12-volt electronics competitors struggled to match. This era represented a uniquely American retail and listening phenomenon. Every day, customers would purchase a brand new $20,000 Ford Mustang, Chevrolet Camaro, or Jeep Grand Cherokee, drive it straight off the dealer lot, and hand the keys to a local stereo shop. Within hours, the brand new factory door panels were removed. The original wiring was bypassed. The cabin was stripped down to bare metal. Installers laid down acoustic damping material, ran thick copper cables, and mounted heavy external crossovers under the front seats. In the tight, vibrating confines of an American car cabin, where cheap factory paper cones made a cassette tape sound like a distant, muffled rumor, the right component speaker system could do the impossible. It could make the singer appear to be sitting on the dashboard, turning a chaotic highway commute into a private, high-fidelity sanctuary. The green injection-molded polypropylene woofer and the flat EMIT tweeter became visual and acoustic status symbols. When a driver rolled their windows down at a stoplight, the clarity of the high frequencies, free from the harsh, ear-piercing distortion of cheaper dome tweeters, immediately signaled the presence of an infinity system. The brand dominated the emerging car audio competition scene, where heavily modified vehicles were judged not just on raw volume, but on soundstage. The perceived width, depth, and precise placement of instruments created by the stereo system. Infinity proved that a car trunk did not just have to rattle with muddy bass, it could breathe with accurate, musical low frequencies. Music? At its cultural peak in the mid-1990s, the independent aftermarket audio industry supported thousands of local stereo stores, employing tens of thousands of skilled American installers, fabricators, and salespeople. Infinity was a primary engine of this local economy, because the Kappa series required dedicated amplifiers and careful crossover tuning. A single speaker sale often triggered the purchase of an entire audio ecosystem. A local shop could charge hundreds of dollars purely for the custom fiberglass labor required to angle an emit tweeter perfectly toward the driver's ears. The speaker worked perfectly. The brand was universally respected. The local dealers were highly profitable. The green cone was no longer just a California engineering experiment. It was a massive, reliable revenue stream for a nationwide network of independent American businesses. Every wire pulled, every crossover mounted, and every door panel modified reinforced the idea that if a driver wanted true fidelity, they had to rebuild the car themselves. But that absolute dominance in the aftermarket contained a fatal, systemic flaw. The independent installation bay had made the green woofer a symbol of American automotive freedom. But the corporate executives in Detroit had been watching the aftermarket cash flow closely. They saw exactly how much money Americans were willing to spend on premium sound, and they were preparing to introduce a level of scale that would make the local stereo shop entirely obsolete. When Chrysler Corporation expanded the Chrysler Infinity audio option across its entire fleet in the early 1990s, the California brand transformed from an aftermarket luxury into a mass-market American institution. The scale of production shifted from high-end audio boutiques in Los Angeles to massive automotive assembly lines in Detroit and Toledo. Suddenly, the Infinity badge was not just for the obsessive enthusiast willing to tear apart their own door panels with a pry bar. It was for the suburban family buying a new Dodge Caravan. It was for the executive leasing a Chrysler New Yorker. It was for the young professional driving a Jeep Grand Cherokee. At a local dealership in Ohio or Pennsylvania, a buyer did not need to understand crossover frequencies or magnetic structures. They only needed to check a single option box on the dealer invoice, and their new vehicle arrived with premium sound already perfectly integrated into the interior. In these early factory systems, Infinity maintained rigorous engineering control. They did not simply license their logo to be stamped on cheap standard-issue paper cones. They designed an actively equalized acoustic space. Active equalization, the process of using electronic filters to correct the specific acoustic flaws of a room before the sound reaches the speaker, meant that the audio system was custom-tuned for the exact volume of glass, plastic, and upholstery inside that specific model of car. To power these systems, Infinity often utilized individual specialized amplifiers mounted directly to the speaker baskets inside the doors, ensuring that every driver received the exact amount of electrical current it required. Music. For a commuter, driving down a dark stretch of Interstate 80, surrounded by engine vibration, wind turbulence, and tire drone, a properly equalized Infinity system did not just play a cassette or a compact disc. It built a private, isolated listening room that completely masked the mechanical roar of the American highway. The acoustic guitar sounded present. The bass was anchored and physical. The stereo image remained stable above the dashboard. The cabin of the automobile had successfully become a high-fidelity sanctuary. By the middle of the decade, the numbers were staggering. Millions of American cars were rolling out of factories with the Infinity name rendered in chrome on the speaker grills. The brand had achieved a level of market penetration that traditional home audio companies could only dream of. The California engineers had solved the most hostile acoustic environment in America, and they were being rewarded with massive, continuous corporate contracts. But this unprecedented reach introduced a dangerous paradox to the American audio market. By proving that a factory-installed stereo system could actually sound excellent, Infinity was quietly dismantling the primary motivation for the aftermarket. If the sound rolling off the dealership lot was already clear, powerful, and backed by a trusted audiophile badge, the average driver no longer felt the burning need to drive to a local stereo store and spend $1,000 ripping their new car apart. The chrome badge of the factory door panel was a triumph of acoustic engineering. Infinity owned the American road, but the sheer scale of its success was quietly engineering the destruction of its own market. The collapse of the American car audio aftermarket did not begin with a sudden bankruptcy or a dramatic factory closure. It began with a quiet, nearly invisible crack in the market, a piece of molded plastic. For decades, the center of an American automobile dashboard featured a universal, rectangular opening known as a single DIN or double DIN slot. This standard geometric space was a mechanical handshake between the automotive giants in Detroit and the local stereo stores across the country. It guaranteed that any driver could slide the cheap factory radio out of the dashboard and slide a high-powered aftermarket receiver in. That aftermarket receiver was the beating heart of the custom audio ecosystem. It sent clean, unequalized electrical signals to the heavy amplifiers in the trunk, which in turn provided the massive current required to physically push an Infinity Kappa polypropylene woofer and light up an EMIT ribbon tweeter. But in the late 1990s, automotive designers realized that the dashboard was prime visual real estate. They stopped using the universal rectangular slot. Instead, automakers began integrating the climate controls, the digital clock, the navigation systems, and the stereo receiver into a single, seamless electronic slab known as an integrated head unit. When a driver looked at the interior of a new luxury SUV, they no longer saw screws to remove a radio. They saw a closed proprietary loop. The local American installer, the fabricator in Ohio who used to build custom fiberglass enclosures, the technician in Texas who rewired door panels. The salesperson at the mall electronics store was suddenly locked out of the dashboard. If the driver could not easily change the radio, they could not easily install the amplifiers. And without the heavy aftermarket amplifiers, the notoriously power-hungry Infinity component systems were effectively useless. The immediate problem for the aftermarket was the physical dashboard lockout. The 12-volt installation shops asked a desperate question: how do we bypass the factory radio? They developed complex line output converters to intercept the audio signal. But as soon as that technical hurdle was cleared, a new, far more dangerous question emerged from the automotive assembly lines. What happens when the factory stops using standard speaker sizes entirely? Detroit began designing vehicles with bizarre, shallow mount speaker enclosures and proprietary wiring harnesses. Automakers started using factory amplifiers that were digitally locked and acoustically mapped exclusively to the cheap paper cones provided by the factory. If a teenager bought a premium set of Infinity component speakers from the Crutchfield catalog and tried to wire them into a modern factory system, the vehicle's internal computer would often reject the electrical impedance load, resulting in choked, distorted sound or a completely muted channel. The car itself was actively fighting the aftermarket. The bitter dissonance of this technological shift was that Infinity had helped engineer its own execution. The historic Chrysler Infinity OEM agreements of the late 1980s and early 1990s had been too successful. By proving that a factory-installed audio package could deliver excellent stereo imaging and tight bass, Infinity had retrained the American consumer. Infinity had a massive portion of the buying public learned that they did not need to spend $1,000 and wait 3 days for a local stereo shop to rebuild their vehicle. They could simply roll the cost of a premium sound system directly into their monthly car payment at the dealership. The market forces of corporate consolidation and changing retail habits collided. The independent 12-volt audio shops began to starve. The highly profitable installation bays that had funded the custom audio boom were slowly reduced to installing remote starters, car alarms, and eventually backup cameras. As the installation bays went quiet, the demand for high-end, mathematically complex component speakers plummeted. Harman International, the massive parent company that owned the Infinity brand, looked at the changing landscape of American retail. The financial logic was undeniable. Selling one pair of $400 Kappa speakers to a hobbyist required retail packaging, magazine marketing, stereo store distribution, and localized dealer support. Selling 1 million pre-tuned integrated audio systems to an automotive giant required a single corporate contract. The aftermarket was a shrinking, chaotic retail fight. The OEM market was a guaranteed multi-million-dollar pipeline. As the parent company pivoted its vast resources towards securing more factory contracts, the original engineering philosophy that had defined Infinity began to change. The Chatsworth obsession with heavy magnet structures, expensive injected plastics, and complex external crossovers was a distinct liability in the world of mass production. Detroit did not want heavy speakers. Heavy speakers added physical weight to the doors, which reduced fuel efficiency. Detroit did not want expensive, delicate ribbon tweeters. They wanted cheap, durable dome tweeters that could be digitally corrected. The era of physical, mechanical high fidelity was ending. It was being replaced by the era of good enough sound. Instead of spending money on better wood, better magnets, and better cones, the industry shifted to active equalization, using hidden software algorithms to mask the acoustic flaws of cheap hardware. The badge remained glued to the door panel, carrying the lingering prestige of the California hi-fi days. The physical weight of the American car speaker was disappearing into digital code, but for the engineers who remembered the original promise of the brand, the deepest structural betrayal was still to come. As the 2000s progressed, the acoustic reality of the American car cabin changed, driven by the massive structural force of corporate consolidation. Corporate consolidation, the process of multiple distinct audio brands being absorbed into a single, massive parent company to share parts, streamline in logistics, and maximize shareholder profit, fundamentally altered what the Infinity name meant. Harman International, the conglomerate that had acquired Infinity in the 1980s, began to rationalize its massive portfolio. They owned JBL, Harman Kardon, Lexicon, Mark Levinson, and Infinity. In a corporate boardroom, keeping these brands completely independent, with their own dedicated engineering teams, custom tooling, and unique manufacturing facilities in California, was financially inefficient. The parent company began to share architectures across brands. The unique, aerospace-inspired engineering culture of the Chatsworth facility was systematically dismantled. The physical production of the speakers was moved offshore to massive global supply chain factories. The intricate EMIT ribbon tweeter, which required careful assembly and specialized magnetic structures, was deemed too expensive and too fragile for the modern mass production era. It was quietly phased out, replaced by standard, cost-effective dome tweeters that could be manufactured by the millions in Asia. The legendary emerald green injection-molded polypropylene woofer, the visual and acoustic signature that had dominated the American aftermarket, disappeared. This ushered in an era of severe brand dilution. Brand dilution, the weakening of a company's reputation when its trusted name is placed on products that no longer match the original engineering standard. was the quiet killer of the Infiniti empire. The chrome badge remained on the door panels of Chrysler, Dodge, and Hyundai vehicles, but the hardware hiding behind the plastic grills had fundamentally changed. A buyer purchasing a new American sedan in 2008 saw the Infiniti logo, but they were no longer receiving an actively equalized, high-current, audiophile-grade component system. They were receiving standard, lightweight paper or cheap plastic cones, powered by a weak digital amplifier hidden under the dashboard. The industry had decided that the American listener no longer needed true high fidelity. They only needed good enough sound, shaped by software. Digital signal processing, or DSP, the use of computer algorithms to artificially boost bass and mask the acoustic flaws of cheap speakers, replaced the heavy copper coils of the physical crossover. The engineers were no longer solving acoustic problems with better magnets and stiffer cones. They were solving them with cheap microchips. This shift completely alienated the exact demographic that had built the brand. The vintage car audio community, the independent installers, and the hi-fi enthusiasts who had championed the Kappa series in the 1990s looked at the modern OEM systems and walked away. Without the passionate endorsement of the American Stereo Store and the 12-volt installation bay, Infiniti lost its cultural armor. It was no longer a premium upgrade. It was just another checkbox on a dealership invoice, competing for attention against heated seats and sunroofs. By the 2010s, the automotive market moved further upscale. When luxury car buyers wanted premium audio, they no longer looked to the old American hi-fi names. Automakers began partnering with ultra-high-end European boutique brands like Bang & Olufsen, Burmester, and Naim. Bose had already locked down the mass-market premium tier. Infiniti was trapped in the middle, a legacy badge utilized primarily to help sell mid-tier family SUVs. Then came the ASKGT, being the final, systemic erasure of the Solis of the company's original purpose. In 2017, Samsung Electronics, the South Korean technology giant, purchased Harman International for $8 billion. The sheer scale of the acquisition shocked the global electronics market. But Samsung did not spend $8 billion because they were interested in building better wooden speaker cabinets, or because they wanted to revive the acoustic suspension designs of the 1970s, or because they cared about the legacy of the green polypropylene car woofer. They bought the company for its connected car telematics, its touchscreen navigation software, and its 5G automotive infrastructure. The transition was complete. The American dashboard was no longer a place for a stereo receiver and an analog volume knob. It was a glowing glass touchscreen, a mobile computer designed for streaming apps, Bluetooth connectivity, and GPS data. The audio system was now merely a secondary accessory to the screen. The independent 12-volt installation bays across California, Texas, and Ohio went dark. The fiberglass molds cracked in dumpsters. The heavy copper wire was scrapped. The mail order catalogs shrank. The aftermarket showrooms emptied. The Chatsworth engineering dream faded. The brand became a software setting. The screen lit up. The American listening room on wheels went silent. The badge survived, but the mechanical soul that built it was gone. The Infiniti brand did not experience a triumphant American resurrection. It was not rescued by a passionate audiophile billionaire or revived by a rogue team of acoustic engineers. It was fully absorbed into the massive corporate machinery of Harman International, which was in turn swallowed by the technological leviathan of Samsung Electronics. Some audio brands die a sudden, dramatic death. Infiniti experienced a slow, highly profitable corporate assimilation. Today, the name survives, but it exists largely as a licensed trademark. An American driver can still buy an entry-level replacement speaker with the Infiniti logo printed on the box, and they can still find the badge integrated into the plastic door panels of modern commuter vehicles. But the aerospace engineering philosophy that defined the Chatsworth era, the stubborn insistence on building uncompromising, high-current audiophile components for the highway, is dead. Yet, outside the corporate boardrooms, the original hardware refuses to disappear. A massive, decentralized American preservation community keeps the vintage legacy alive. Across the country, in dimly lit garages, basement workshops, and local repair benches, enthusiasts actively hunt for surviving pieces of the golden era. They scour Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, and eBay for original Kappa component systems and heavy reference standard amplifiers. On specialized vintage car audio forums and Reddit communities, collectors trade wiring diagrams and crossover schematics. Because the original polyurethane foam surrounds the flexible ring around a woofer cone that lets it move in and out, inevitably deteriorate and rot into black dust over the decades, a thriving cottage industry has emerged to save them. Refoaming is no longer just a mechanical repair, it is an act of historical preservation. Independent technicians and dedicated hobbyists spend hours carefully scraping away the decayed residue of the 1990s, meticulously gluing down fresh rubber to ensure the heavy green cones can push air once again, recapping, replacing old, dried-out capacitors in a crossover to restore or stabilize speaker performance has become a mandatory ritual for those trying to save the EMIT tweeters from electrical failure. This labor-intensive preservation exists for one specific, functional reason. The original hardware still matters. It matters because a restored American Infinity Kappa system from 1993, properly wired into a heavy car door, possesses a physical capability that modern, software-driven automotive audio cannot easily fake. A modern digital signal processor can artificially manipulate a cheap plastic speaker to create the illusion of bass, but it cannot replicate the instantaneous, crystalline transient response of a true electromagnetic induction ribbon tweeter. Sound still begins where air moves. A heavy magnet structure, a rigid injection molded cone, and a carefully calculated analog crossover network anchor the music in the physical room. They create a legitimate stereo image without needing a touchscreen or a software update to function. Today, the physical landscape where this empire was built has been paved over. The Chatsworth, California audio labs and assembly floors, where Arnie Nudell and his team first experimented with aerospace plastics, are gone. The surrounding San Fernando Valley industrial parks that once housed bustling cabinet shops and driver testing facilities have been replaced by generic corporate offices, warehouse fulfillment centers, and apartment complexes. The thousands of independent 12-volt stereo stores that proudly displayed the green woofers on their showroom walls have largely vanished. Their custom installation bays converted into fast food restaurants, vape shops, or simply left as empty retail shells in fading American strip malls. But there is a surprising footnote to this corporate erasure. Long after the original founders left, and long after the American car audio aftermarket collapsed, the EMIT tweeters retained such a legendary reputation for high-frequency accuracy that a bizarre reversal occurred. Audiophiles and DIY speaker builders began actively cannibalizing old, wrecked cars just to harvest the ribbon tweeters from the dashboard. They took these salvaged automotive parts and wired them into custom wooden cabinets for their home living rooms. The car speaker had become so accurate and so highly coveted that the high-end home listening room demanded it back. The story of Infinity Car Audio reveals a profound truth about how America builds, sells, hears, and ultimately discards sound. It highlights the vast gap between what listeners say they value, fidelity, craftsmanship, honest engineering, and longevity, and what the modern consumer market actually rewards. Infinity proved that the American automobile could be transformed into a flawless acoustic sanctuary, provided the listener was willing to invest in heavy magnets, complex crossovers, and skilled domestic labor. But the market ultimately chose integration over isolation and convenience over fidelity. The American driver traded the tactile satisfaction of the stereo rack for the seamless glow of the touchscreen. Still, the original promise has not been entirely erased. Surviving in the quiet corners of the country, bolted into the doors of an old Jeep Cherokee parked behind a garage in the American Midwest. Its heavy crossovers hidden under the seats, waiting for a key turn, a rush of electrical current, and one more song. See you in the next one. See you.